This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting on over 750 stations around the country, on Pacifica and NPR, low-power FM, college and community radio stations, on public access TV and PBS TV stations, and both TV satellite networks, Dish Network, Channel 9415 Free Speech TV, Channel 9410 Link TV, and Direct TV, Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our guests are Ambassador Martin Indyk, his new book, Innocent Abroad. Martin Indyk is currently head of the Saban Center at the Brookings Institution, and Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein is author of several books, including The Holocaust Industry, An Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Juan?
Well, Ambassador Indyk, I'd like to ask you about the timing of this Israeli offensive. Clearly, it's in the waning days of the Bush administration and before President-elect Obama is inaugurated as president. Your sense of whether the timing had something to do with the reality that the U.S. response in many ways would be muted, or at least in transition as the administration is in transition?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the ceasefire basically had come to an end. It was a 6-month ceasefire. And so I don't think that the Israelis purposely decided that this was the moment to strike. If Hamas had not launched rockets, I think they would have been perfectly happy to continue with the ceasefire. But once that rocket barrage came down, I do think that Ehud Barak, the Israeli defense minister, who is really the strategist of this whole operation, and is a man who I worked with very closely when I was ambassador in Israel. He was Israeli prime minister at the time, and we were trying at the end of the Clinton administration to get a full comprehensive peace in Clinton's last year and Barak's first year in office as Prime Minister. But what I learnt in those days of working with him was that he's a man who looks at operations with a very strict timetable. He actually dismantles clocks for a hobby. In other words, he's kind of obsessed with timing. And we saw this very clearly, and it's something I outline in my book, in the way that he tried to conduct the peace operations in the year 2000, and he miscalculated the timing then. Now he faces 2 dates. The first one is the one that you referred to, January 20th, when a new president comes into office here in Washington, and a president, George W. Bush, who's been very supportive of Israel and essentially, for most of the time in office, given Israel a blank check when it comes to dealing with Hamas, which he sees as a terrorist organization, and this is part of the war on terror. So yes, I think that Barak probably calculated that he needed to get this operation over on Bush's watch and have it finished before Barack Obama came into office. There is another date that I think probably was even more important in his own mind, and that is the date of February 10th, in which he, along with Israel's other politicians, will have to face the Israeli electorate in a general election unless those elections are postponed, and that doesn't look likely. And for that reason as well, he needs the operation over. If instead the Israeli army goes in and takes control of Gaza City and Jabalia refugee camp and Rafah City in the south of Gaza, and suddenly, the Israeli electorate on February 10th see that Israel is now back in occupation of Gaza, which they left because they didn't want to stay in occupation there. They left unilaterally several years ago. And the Israeli soldiers are dying, and the whole world is condemning Israel, and there's a crisis in U.S.-Israel relations with the new president. They will not reward Ehud Barak at all. So that's why I think you see already today much greater interest on his part and the part of the government of Israel in working out a ceasefire. I believe that they will try, to the extent that they can do anything about it, to get that in place before Obama comes into office.
Norman Finkelstein,
so that he can show an Israeli electorate that this was a successful operation from Israel's point of view.
Norman Finkelstein, do you agree with Ambassador Indyk that Israel would have continued the ceasefire if Hamas hadn't started firing rockets into Israel?
Well, the record shows that Hamas wanted to continue the ceasefire, but only on condition that Israel eases the blockade. As your viewers surely know, long before Hamas began the retaliatory rocket attacks on Israel, Palestinians are facing a humanitarian crisis in Gaza because of the blockade. The former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, described what was going on in Gaza as a destruction of a civilization. This was during the ceasefire period. Now, I think it's important to keep in mind, Mr. Indyk wants to talk about the book. Well, I think we should talk about the book. In fact, I stayed up till 1:30 a.m. to complete the book, make sure I read up to page 415, read every word of the book. The problem is with his book, as with his presentation here, is he systematically misrepresents the record of the peace process. He's lying not only to his readers, but to the American people. He keeps putting the burden of responsibility for the impasse in the peace process on the Palestinians. A moment ago, he referred to the rejectionists who are trying to block a settlement of the conflict. What does the record show? The record shows, as I said a moment ago, for the past 20 or more years, the entire international community has sought to settle the conflict in the June 1967 border with a just resolution of the refugee question. Are all 164 nations of the United Nations the rejectionists? And are the only people in favor of peace the United States, Israel, Nauru, Palau, Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Australia? Who are the rejectionists? Who's opposing a peace? According to Mr. Indyk's account of the negotiations that culminated in the Camp David and Taba meetings, he says it was the Palestinians that were blocking a settlement. What does the record show? The record shows that in every crucial issue raised at Camp David, then under the Clinton parameters, and then in Taba, at every single point, all the concessions came from the Palestinians. Israel didn't make any concessions. Every concession came from the Palestinians. The Palestinians have repeatedly expressed the willingness to settle the conflict in accordance with international law. The law is very clear. July 2004, the highest judicial body in the world, the International Court of Justice, ruled Israel has no title to any of the West Bank and any of Gaza. They have no title to Jerusalem. East Jerusalem, according to the highest judicial body in the world, is occupied Palestinian territory. The International Court of Justice ruled all the settlements in the West Bank are illegal under international law. Now, the important point is, on all those questions, the Palestinians were willing to make concessions. They were willing to allow Israel to keep 60% of the settlements, 80% of the settlers. They were willing to compromise on Jerusalem. They were willing to give up basically on the right of return. They made all the concessions. Israel didn't make any concessions. How is this rendered in Martin Indyk's book? It's rendered as, quote, Barak's bold and courageous initiatives for peace, and Arafat and the PLO rejecting the bold and courageous initiatives of Barak. Constantly, he turns reality on its head.